The narrow cobblestone streets of Toledo's historic district were bustling with tourists and locals alike on a warm Saturday afternoon in June 2018, as Cristiano Ronaldo made his way through the ancient city's winding pathways, taking advantage of a rare free weekend to explore Spain's cultural treasures, away from the constant scrutiny and pressure that accompanied his public appearances in Madrid. He had driven to Toledo alone, without his usual security detail or entourage, seeking the anonymity and peace that came from blending into crowds of tourists who were focused on medieval architecture, historic landmarks, and traditional Spanish culture, rather than contemporary football celebrities and their carefully orchestrated public personas. Dressed in simple jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and baseball cap pulled low over his distinctive features, Ronaldo had successfully maintained his anonymity for several hours while wandering through museums, churches, and artisan shops that lined the streets of this UNESCO World Heritage Site that had served as Spain's capital city for centuries before Madrid assumed that role. As evening approached and the tourist crowds began to thin, Ronaldo found himself in a quieter section of the old city where residential buildings dating back several centuries housed local families whose ancestors had lived in Toledo for generations, creating an atmosphere of authentic Spanish life that contrasted dramatically with the cosmopolitan environment of modern Madrid, where Ronaldo spent most of his time surrounded by international influences and contemporary luxury. The peaceful solitude of his afternoon exploration was suddenly shattered when Ronaldo became aware that he was being followed by three men who had been tracking his movements for at least 20 minutes. Maintaining a discreet distance, while clearly coordinating their surveillance through hand signals and strategic positioning that suggested they were experienced in stalking targets and waiting for optimal opportunities to strike when victims were isolated and vulnerable. Initially, Ronaldo had dismissed his growing sense of unease as normal paranoia that came from years of high-profile living, but as the men began closing the distance between themselves and their target, while moving toward a particularly narrow and deserted alley that would provide perfect cover for criminal activity, he realized that his situation was becoming genuinely dangerous and that he needed to find safety immediately before these predators could complete whatever plan they had been developing during their careful surveillance. The men appeared to be local criminals rather than obsessed fans or paparazzi, and their behavior suggested they were motivated by robbery rather than celebrity stalking, but their coordinated approach and obvious experience in hunting human prey made them potentially very dangerous, regardless of their specific motivations or ultimate intentions. As Ronaldo quickened his pace and tried to navigate toward more populated areas where potential witnesses might deter criminal activity, he discovered that the ancient street layout was working against him, as the narrow medieval pathways created numerous opportunities for ambush, while limiting his options for escape or evasion. Just as the three men were positioning themselves to close off his escape routes and force him into the isolated alley where they could complete their attack without interference from witnesses or law enforcement, Ronaldo heard a sharp voice calling out in Spanish from a second-story window above the street where they were walking. "Cristiano, up here, quickly! Come inside immediately!" The voice belonged to an elderly woman who was leaning out of her window and gesturing urgently for him to enter the building below her apartment. And although he had never seen this woman before and had no idea how she knew his identity or why she was offering assistance, the genuine concern and authority in her voice convinced him that she represented safety rather than additional danger. Without hesitation, Ronaldo ran toward the building's entrance as the woman buzzed him through the security door and called down instructions for reaching her apartment on the second floor, while the three men who had been stalking him realized that their opportunity had been lost and melted back into the shadows, rather than risk being identified or confronted by additional witnesses who might emerge to investigate the commotion. The elderly woman who had rescued Ronaldo was named Esperanza Morales, and she was 83 years old, a widow who had lived in the same apartment for over 50 years and had developed the observational skills and street wisdom that came from decades of watching life unfold on the historic streets below her windows. She had immediately recognized Ronaldo despite his casual disguise and had been watching with growing alarm as the three men tracked his movements with obvious predatory intent. Understanding from their body language and coordinated behavior that they were planning some form of criminal assault that she felt compelled to prevent through whatever means were available to her. As Ronaldo climbed the narrow stairs to Esperanza's apartment, breathing heavily from the adrenaline rush of his narrow escape and the quick sprint to safety, he was greeted by a small, dignified woman whose sharp eyes and calm demeanor suggested both intelligence and the kind of inner strength that develops through surviving numerous challenges and adversities over a long and eventful life. "Those men have been watching you for quite some time," Esperanza explained as she invited Ronaldo into her modest but immaculately maintained apartment that was filled with family photographs, religious artifacts, and the accumulated treasures of a lifetime spent in the same community. "I've seen them before in this neighborhood, and they're known for targeting tourists who appear to have money or valuable possessions. They would have cornered you in that alley and robbed you of everything you had, and possibly worse if you had resisted or if they thought you might be able to identify them later." Ronaldo was profoundly grateful for Esperanza's intervention and immediate assistance, but he was also deeply moved by her willingness to involve herself in a potentially dangerous situation in order to help a complete stranger, demonstrating the kind of moral courage and community responsibility that seemed increasingly rare in contemporary society, where people often chose to avoid involvement in other people's problems rather than risk personal inconvenience or potential retaliation. As they sat in Esperanza's small living room, while waiting for the immediate danger to pass and for Ronaldo to arrange safe transportation back to Madrid, their conversation revealed the remarkable life story of this woman who had rescued him from what could have been a very serious criminal assault. Esperanza had been born in Toledo during the Spanish Civil War and had lived through the hardships of that conflict, the subsequent Franco dictatorship, and the transition to democratic government that had transformed Spain during her lifetime, experiencing firsthand the social and political changes that had shaped modern Spanish society, while maintaining her residence in the same historic neighborhood where her family had lived for generations. She had worked as a seamstress for most of her adult life, supporting herself and her late husband while raising 3 children who had all moved to other cities for education and career opportunities, leaving her alone in the apartment that contained the memories and possessions of a lifetime spent in service to family, community, and traditional values that emphasized helping others regardless of personal cost or inconvenience. During their conversation, Ronaldo learned that Esperanza lived on a modest pension that barely covered her basic expenses, and that she had been struggling recently with health problems that made it difficult for her to maintain her apartment and manage daily activities that had become increasingly challenging as she aged and her physical capabilities diminished. Despite her own difficulties and limitations, she had not hesitated to intervene when she saw someone in danger, demonstrating the kind of selfless character and moral strength that impressed Ronaldo deeply and reminded him of his own grandmother's values and commitment to helping others whenever possible. When Ronaldo's security team finally arrived to escort him safely back to Madrid several hours later, he had already made several decisions about how he wanted to express his gratitude to Esperanza for her life-saving intervention and ongoing kindness. Over the following weeks, he arranged for comprehensive medical care to address her health problems, home modifications to make her apartment safer and more comfortable for aging in place, and financial support that would ensure her security and independence for the remainder of her life, without requiring her to leave the community and neighborhood that had been her home for over 50 years. However, Ronaldo's gratitude extended far beyond material assistance, as he also established a personal relationship with Esperanza that continued for years after their initial meeting, visiting her regularly when his schedule permitted, calling frequently to check on her welfare, and including her in family celebrations and special occasions that demonstrated his genuine affection and respect for the woman who had risked her own safety to protect him from criminal assault. Esperanza became something of a surrogate grandmother figure in Ronaldo's life, providing him with perspective, wisdom, and emotional grounding that helped him maintain connection to traditional values and authentic human relationships despite the artificial pressures and superficial interactions that characterized much of his professional life as an international celebrity and public figure. Their friendship became known throughout Toledo's historic district, where Esperanza was regarded as something of a local hero for her courage in confronting dangerous criminals and her ongoing relationship with one of the world's most famous athletes. But she never sought publicity or recognition for her actions, preferring to maintain the quiet dignity and privacy that had characterized her long life in the ancient city. Years later, when Esperanza passed away peacefully at the age of 89, Ronaldo served as one of the pallbearers at her funeral and established a scholarship fund in her memory that provided educational opportunities for young people from Toledo who demonstrated the same moral courage, community commitment, and willingness to help others that had defined Esperanza's character and motivated her to risk her own safety to save a stranger from danger on a narrow cobblestone street in Spain's ancient capital city.